morning and welcome to this Wednesday, November the 4th version of Sunrise to Sunset with Pastor Gene. Today we're looking at 1 Peter chapter 3. Now, if you've already read this passage of Scripture, then you may be wondering, well, what in the world is he going to do with this when it comes to marriage and when it comes to husbands and wives? And then after you hear what I have to say about it, I hope you'll go back and read it to make sure I have given you the right counsel on it, because this is a very important passage of Scripture, and I'm going to try to connect it in ways that hopefully will be beneficial in the future. The first seven verses of 1 Peter 3 are not intended to be taken as permission for husbands to be abusive towards wives or wives to be abusive toward husbands. Sometimes I think we take the Bible and use it to justify some of our own bad behavior. And that's the same thing as taking God's name in vain. So I just want to say back off of that if you do that, okay? I care about your soul. The permission is not given for husbands here, but to do that, but to allow wives to use their inner beauty, their inner holiness, the kinds of things that 1 Peter here is talking about, the teachings of Christ that are in an obedient and living hope heart, so that those inner beauty things can have an impact on somebody who may just be a real jerk. And so that's kind of the language here. And consequently, husbands who are stronger in physical strength, the things on the outer that look stronger, they are to use that inner strength to honor the wife, to honor their wife. So it's not about the way we look or our physique or something like that. It's about what's inside of us. It's what comes out of us that defiles us. And if what is coming out of us is love and honor and cherish and those kinds of things and respect, if those kinds of things are coming out of us, then things will be going as they should. So we're supposed to use these good things, not only in our marriage, but in our relationship with God and with one another. Now, though it's not stated here, it was definitely in Paul's thinking that when you were talking about the husband, you were talking about Jesus. When you were talking about the wife, you were talking about the church. And he particularly does that in Ephesians. But here, I think it's a much more direct instruction to husbands and wives about the way they're supposed to relate to one another. He goes back into some more talking about suffering for doing right and turning away from evil to do good and seeking peace and pursue it. That's in verse 11. And in verse 15, he says, "But in your hearts, sanctify Christ as Lord. Always be ready to make your defense to anyone who demands from you an accounting for hope that is in you." My colleagues in ministry, staff members, associate pastors in the past often would say, well, why do you always write a manuscript for a sermon? Well, because I want to always be ready. And it comes from this passage of Scripture. I want to always be ready for anyone who demands an accounting of what I've done. So every week, I put together a manuscript and have for 43 years and will continue to do that as long as I sit in this chair or stand in that pulpit, because I believe that being able to give a strict account like the hymn, "A Charge to Keep I Have," suggests that we do, is going to be required. So why not get in practice right now? So I encourage everyone in your own way to figure out how that would happen. No one wants to suffer. And hopefully no one wants to cause anyone to suffer, which goes back to the whole thing about the husband and the wife at the beginning of this passage. But what we have to figure out here is, what is the difference between God's will in a situation and our own? And then after we figure out what God's will is in a situation, if it's in opposition to our own, choose God's will. And God's will is always going to be one of a living hope and a loving hope and a loving faith. In verse 21, I've been reading this for years and I've never noticed this, but verse 21 says, "And baptism, which this prefigured, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ." Think about that for a moment. Our baptism is an appeal to God for a good conscience, so that we can live this life of faith and hope and love. So I would encourage you, I would appeal to you through the remembrance of your baptismal vow to remember that obedient suffering leads to a relationship with God, to the conquering of sin and evil, and ultimately to victory. And that comes some point in our lives from sunrise to sunset.